Story 1. Coworker pretended to help fix my dad's car, then used his cam to frame us for theft, and got my dad fired. So, we set up hidden cameras to catch him stealing, and now he's in jail. Hi Reddit, I'm a 27-em who's been dealing with a really tricky situation at work, and I need some outside perspective. I spend a lot of time reading stories on here about people who suddenly change their behavior, and it's got me questioning everything. The thing is, I've got this coworker who's been causing problems, and his recent change in attitude has me seriously confused. I keep wondering if people can actually change that quickly, or if there's always something else going on beneath the surface. I should probably start with some background about my family. My parents came to the US from Mexico right before I was born. They were both working on getting their citizenship while raising me, doing everything by the book. My dad got his citizenship first, and my mom was nearly there too. She was actually just weeks away from her final citizenship interview when everything changed. A drunk driver ran a red light one night, and just like that my mom was gone. I was too young to really remember her, but my dad made sure I knew everything about her. He kept all her citizenship paperwork in a box, and sometimes I catch him looking through it, especially on hard days. School was pretty rough for me growing up. Word got around about my family's situation, and some parents in our neighborhood had really messed up ideas about immigration. They'd tell their kids that my parents were criminals for having me before getting their citizenship, which makes zero sense, but try explaining that to a bunch of grade schoolers. These kids would corner me at recess, calling my parents illegals and saying my mom deserved what happened to her. I ended up in the principal's office at least once a week for fighting. My teachers tried to be understanding, but there's only so many times you can let a kid off for throwing punches before it becomes a problem. The worst part was seeing my dad's face every time he had to leave work to pick me up after a fight. He never got mad though, he just looked tired. My dad basically gave up any chance of a personal life to take care of me. He was working at a warehouse during the day and doing janitorial work at night, sometimes not getting home until 2:00 or 3:00 in the morning. We didn't have any family here to help out, so most of his second paycheck went straight to babysitters. I'd stay up late some nights pretending to be asleep when he got home, and I'd hear him in the kitchen making my lunch for the next day. He'd pack himself just a small sandwich, if anything at all. Sometimes he'd skip meals entirely, saying he wasn't hungry, but I knew he was just making sure there was enough food for me. When other kids complained about their parents not buying them the latest toys or video games, I just couldn't relate. All I could think about was my dad barely sleeping, just trying to keep a roof over our heads. Everything changed when I was 8 years old, and it all started because my dad couldn't ignore someone who needed help. He was dragging himself home after another double shift when he spotted this guy pulled over on the side of the road. Even though he was exhausted, my dad still pulled over to help. That guy turned out to be Barry, and his car just needed a jump start. While they were waiting for Barry's battery to charge up, they got talking and realized they had way more in common than they expected. Barry was raising his son, Ryan, alone after losing his wife to cancer, and Ryan was dealing with the same kind of crap at school that I was, except in his case, it was because they were black. It hit my dad pretty hard hearing about another single father going through similar struggles. Barry would bring Ryan over to hang out with me, and suddenly I had someone who actually understood what I was going through at school. While we played video games or watched cartoons, our dads would be out in the driveway, heads buried under the hood of whatever car needed fixing. By then, my dad had gotten pretty good at fixing things around the house out of necessity. We couldn't afford to call repairmen, so he learned everything from YouTube videos. Barry picked up on how naturally my dad took to car repair, and one day, he made an offer. He owned this auto shop in town and wanted my dad to come work for him. The pay wasn't anything crazy, but it meant my dad could finally quit his second job. I started seeing him at dinner time instead of just catching glimpses of him between shifts. Sometimes I'd even wake up to find him actually sleeping in his bed instead of passed out on the couch still in his work clothes. I started hanging around the shop after school, picking up little things here and there about cars while Ryan was buried in his criminal justice textbooks and dreaming about law school. I was learning how to change oil and replace spark plugs. My dad would come home and find me watching car repair videos online, taking notes and asking him questions about everything I'd learned. By the time I finished high school, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. Ryan took a job at Target to help pay for his college tuition, but I went straight to work at Barry's shop. Some of my teachers were disappointed. They thought I was wasting my potential by not going to college, but honestly, working alongside my dad at the shop felt more right than any classroom ever had. A few years into working at the shop, I met Tracy at a friend's birthday party. She was 3 years older than me and worked as a dental hygienist. We clicked right away, and after dating for a while, we started talking about moving in together. By then, I'd saved up enough from the shop to make it happen. Packing up my room at Dad's house was harder than I expected, not because of the distance, since I'd still see him every day at work, but because it felt like the end of an era. The night before I moved out, Dad and I stayed up late just talking about Mom, about all the tough years when he was working 2 jobs, and about how far we'd come. He tried to act cool about me moving out, but I caught him getting a little misty-eyed when he helped me load the last box into my car. Everything at the shop was going great until Barry hired Lance last year. Remember that coworker I mentioned earlier who's got me questioning everything? That Lance. From day one, it was clear he had a problem with me and my dad being Mexican. His truck was plastered with those political stickers that tell you everything you need to know about a person, and he made no effort to hide his views. This morning he walked in and saw us working on a customer's car. He just stood there shaking his head before making some comment about us stealing jobs from real Americans. I wanted to say something back, but my dad just gave me that look he used to give me in school when I'd get in fights, the one that said it wasn't worth it. About a month after Lance started, tools began disappearing from the shop. At first, it was just small stuff, a socket here, an impact driver there, the kind of things that could easily get misplaced in a busy garage. But then, an entire set of right grip wrenches vanished overnight. These weren't exactly top-dollar tools, but in our line of work, every tool matters. Barry was furious. He called everyone into the garage one morning, even the front desk staff who barely set foot near the tools, and gave this whole speech about trust and responsibility. He made it clear that if anyone knew anything, they needed to speak up. Since my dad and I worked closest to Lance, we started noticing patterns between when tools would disappear and when Lance was around them last. We tried to keep an eye on him without being obvious about it, but Lance caught on pretty quick. Every time he noticed us watching, he'd throw out some racist comment about Mexicans swimming across borders or make jokes about us being lazy while we spied on him instead of working. After weeks of this, my dad finally went to Barry about our suspicions. My dad's not the type to complain or cause trouble. He always taught me to keep my head down and let my work speak for itself. So when he actually spoke up about Lance, Barry took it seriously, but without concrete proof. All Barry could do was warn Lance that he'd be fired if anything else went missing. The tool disappearances stopped after that conversation, which pretty much confirmed what we already knew about who was behind it. That warning from Barry sent Lance over the edge. He cornered my dad in the parking lot that evening, getting right in his face about how we were trying to steal jobs from hardworking white men like him. After that, Lance turned into a complete nightmare to work with. He'd have these random outbursts while working on cars, throwing tools around and damaging vehicles in the process. One time he got so angry, he put a huge dent in a customer's door with a wrench. It was like watching a grown man throw toddler tantrums, except these tantrums were costing the shop money and putting our safety at risk. One of our regular customers, this older lady who'd been coming to us for years, happened to walk in during one of Lance's meltdowns. She watched him slam tools around and kick a toolbox while my dad was trying to finish up work on her car. Barry managed to smooth things over with her, but you could tell he was at his limit with Lance. He pulled Lance into his office and told him straight up that one more outburst, and he'd be out of a job. Instead of taking the warning seriously, Lance decided to blame my dad, since it was his customer who complained. That evening, in the parking lot, Lance got in our faces and told us we were going to pay for almost getting him fired. But then something weird happened. The next week, Lance was like a completely different person. He wasn't exactly friendly, but all the aggressive behavior just stopped. No more racist comments, no more throwing tools, nothing. My dad and I kept looking at each other across the garage, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Then one evening, as we were closing up shop, my dad's car wouldn't start. The alternator had been going bad for a while, but money was tight, and Dad kept putting off replacing it. We all knew it was just a matter of time before it died completely. I was about to offer my dad a ride home when Lance pulled his truck around. Instead of leaving like he usually did, he parked right in front of my dad's car. Given everything that had happened, I started planning how I'd handle things if this turned into another confrontation. But instead of starting trouble, Lance stepped out of his truck and asked about the alternator. Anyone who'd been in the shop lately, I could tell that's what was wrong. The car had been making that distinctive whining noise for weeks. What shocked us was when Lance actually offered to fix it. He told my dad to just set out some tools by the car while he went to use the bathroom and make a quick phone call. My dad and I shared a look, both thinking the same thing. Was this some kind of trap? But Lance seemed genuinely willing to help, so my dad went ahead and gathered the tools from the garage. When Lance came back out, my dad tried to work out payment details, offering to compensate him for the time and parts, but Lance just waved him off, saying he owed us for how he'd been acting lately and wanted to make things right. He promised to have the car running by morning. I wanted to believe he was trying to change, but after months of dealing with his racist comments and violent outbursts, it was hard to trust this sudden transformation. I drove my dad home that night, and we spent most of the ride debating whether we'd made a huge mistake leaving the car with Lance. The only thing that gave us any comfort was that Lance had refused payment. Usually, when someone's trying to scam you, they want money up front. When we pulled into the shop the next morning, My dad's car was right where we'd left it, and sure enough, it started up perfectly. Lance had replaced the entire alternator overnight. My dad tried again to pay him for the parts at least, but Lance insisted it was on the house. He kept saying he wanted to make amends for his past behavior. The whole thing left me feeling uneasy. Either Lance had had some kind of miraculous change of heart, or he was up to something. After everything we'd been through with him, I couldn't help but suspect it was the latter. It's been a full day since Lance fixed my dad's car, and he's still acting like a completely different person. No racist comments, no angry outbursts, just normal workplace conversation and even a few friendly nods in our direction. After nearly a year of dealing with his hatred and abuse, this sudden change is giving me whiplash. Maybe Barry's threat to fire him finally made him realize he needed to change, or maybe fixing my dad's car was his way of showing he wanted to make things right. But something about this whole situation just doesn't sit right with me. I'd really appreciate some outside perspective on this. Have any of you experienced someone changing this dramatically this quickly? Update 1. Hey Reddit, I need to update you on my situation with Lance, and it's not good news. Remember how I was asking if people could really change that quickly? Well, I got my answer, and I feel like an idiot for even considering that Lance might have turned over a new leaf. A few days after Lance fixed my dad's car, Barry discovered more missing tools from the shop. This time, it was just some crossforce wrenches, not even a complete set and definitely not as expensive as the tools that went missing before. They were so basic that none of us even noticed they were gone at first. But when Barry found out, he was absolutely livid. What happened next was weird. Instead of gathering everyone like he did last time, Barry went straight for Lance. We all kind of nodded to each other, thinking finally Lance was about to get what was coming to him. But when Barry called Lance into his office, Lance didn't look worried at all. He just got up with his calm smile and followed Barry like they were going to have a friendly chat. I've worked with Lance long enough to know that when he looks that satisfied with himself, something bad is about to happen. After some time, Lance came out of Barry's office with this smug look on his face. Then Barry appeared, looking like someone had just punched him in the stomach, and called my dad into his office. I wanted to go with him, but I knew this was between them. My dad told me everything that happened when he came out. Barry started the conversation by asking my dad if he was having money problems. He brought up how Dad had been putting off fixing the alternator, trying to make it sound like my father was desperate for cash. My dad explained that he just tries to get the most life out of parts before replacing them, something Barry should have known after 15 years of friendship. But Barry wasn't buying it. He got really quiet, looked my dad straight in the eye, and asked if there was anything he wanted to confess. The way my dad described it, it was like Barry was giving him one last chance to come clean about something. When my dad said he had nothing to confess, Barry pulled out his phone and showed him some security footage. The video showed my dad going into the garage that night Lance offered to fix his car, grabbing some tools, and walking out with him. Then it showed me picking him up and us driving away. The whole thing looked terrible, like we'd stolen the tools and made a getaway together. That's when everything clicked. He'd been recording the whole thing, probably planning to use it against us from the moment he offered to help. When my dad asked where the footage came from, Barry explained that Lance had captured it all on his truck's dash cam. Lance had planned this from the start. He'd probably been watching my dad struggle with that alternator for weeks, just waiting for the perfect moment. And because I gave my dad a ride home that night, Lance managed to make me look complicit in the whole thing. The dash cam footage made it look like we were working together to steal from the shop. My dad tried desperately to explain the truth to Barry, how Lance had specifically told him to get those tools, how this was all a setup, but Barry wasn't hearing it. According to the footage, Lance was inside the building when my dad took the tools, so how could he have told my dad to get them? To make things worse, Barry pointed out that my dad's been fixing cars for over a decade. Why would he suddenly need Lance's help with something as basic as an alternator? Everything that made Lance's offer seem suspicious to us at first was now being used against my dad. To top it all off, Lance had apparently gone to Barry, acting all concerned, saying he'd noticed the tools were missing, but wanted to give my dad a chance to return them before reporting anything. He played the whole thing perfectly, making himself look like the good guy while destroying my dad's reputation. In the end, Barry had no choice but to fire my dad. The only reason I still have my job is because my dad, even while watching his whole life fall apart, made sure to tell Barry that I had nothing to do with any of it. Before I left that day, Barry pulled me aside and warned me to watch my every move from now on. He said I should treat every moment at work like I've got a target on my back, document everything I do, take pictures of tools before and after I use them, and never work alone if I can help it. The whole conversation made me feel sick. This was the same shop where I'd practically grown up, where I used to come after school to watch my dad work, and now it felt like hostile territory. I used to think Lance was just another racist hothead who couldn't control his temper, but this whole thing showed me how wrong I was. Update 2. Hey Reddit, I need to give you all another update, and things aren't getting any better. It's been about a month since my dad got fired. And while Lance hasn't tried anything new at work, no missing tools, no obvious setups, he's definitely showing his true colors again. He's dropped the nice guy act completely, probably because he knows I'm not stupid enough to fall for it twice. Instead, he's just settled into being openly cruel. Every morning when I come in, Lance has some new comment about my dad. How's your old man enjoying his free time? Or must be nice to sleep in every day. The other day, he even had the nerve to ask if Dad was learning Spanish again, since he had so much spare time now. He says it all with his smug little smile, like he's so proud of himself for destroying a man's career. I keep thinking about how my dad spent 15 years building his reputation at this shop, working his way up from nothing, just for Lance to tear it all down in one night, because he couldn't stand the idea of Mexicans being successful. The worst part is watching Lance walk around the shop like he owns the place now, knowing there's nothing I can do about it without risking my own job. Every time he makes another comment about my dad, I have to grip whatever tool I'm holding a little tighter, just to keep myself from doing something I'll regret. Some days, I catch myself gripping my wrench a little too tightly when Lance walks by, imagining all the ways I could wipe that smug smile off his face. It's exactly like being back in middle school, listening to those kids talk trash about my parents being illegals, and while I'm stuck at work trying not to commit assault with a socket wrench, my dad's whole life is falling apart. Turns out that the alternator Lance installed was some cheap piece of junk from a salvage yard. It died after just a few weeks. Now Dad's car is having all kinds of other problems too. He's been calling different shops for quotes, but everything's way more expensive than what he can afford right now. Then last week, just when we thought things couldn't get worse, they did. The car repairs ate up most of his savings, and he came up short on rent. My dad, who's never missed a payment on anything in his life, had to go beg his landlord for more time, telling me to watch him go through this. The man worked 2 jobs for years just to keep a roof over my head, and now he can't even pay his own rent. Lance didn't just take his job, he took his dignity too. My dad tried everything to work something out with his landlord. He offered to pay extra next month, suggested doing maintenance work around the property to make up the difference, anything to buy himself some time, but they wouldn't budge, just slapped him with a 10-day notice like he hadn't been a perfect tenant for the past 8 years. Tracy offered to pick up some work so I could help my dad more. She managed to land a serving job at this local restaurant, but by then it was already too late. Last weekend, I helped my dad pack up everything he owns into boxes and move it all into our spare room. The man who worked his fingers to the bone to give me a good life is now sleeping on his son's futon. The job search has been a nightmare. My dad's been going door to door at every garage and repair shop in town, but nobody will touch him. His situation is almost impossible. The only real job reference he has is Barry. Everything before the shop was cash under the table work. When he first came to America, we thought maybe Barry would at least give him a neutral reference, considering their 15 years of friendship. But no, he's been telling everyone who calls that my dad's a thief. Yesterday, Dad came home from another failed interview, and I overheard him in his room crying. The last time I heard my father cry was at my mom's funeral. I even tried reaching out to Ryan, hoping he could talk some sense into his dad. After all, our families have known each other for almost 20 years. But when Ryan confronted Barry about blacklisting my dad from every auto shop in town, Barry just got even more upset. He kept saying how this hurt more because my dad was like family, like somehow that made the betrayal worse. I wanted to scream that there was no betrayal, that Lance had set the whole thing up, but what's the point? Barry made his choice about who to believe. Every night, my dad comes home looking more defeated than the day before. This morning I found him at the kitchen table at 5:00 a.m., searching through job listings for under-the-table work, the kind of jobs he used to do before he got his citizenship. He looked so ashamed when I walked in, like I'd caught him doing something wrong. I never wanted to work like this again, he told me. I thought once I became a citizen, I was done having to hide in the shadows. He worked so hard to build a legitimate life here to prove all those racist parents from my childhood wrong. Speaking of Lance, he's practically glowing these days. Every time he sees how much this is killing me, his smile gets a little wider. Some days, I have to leave the garage when he's around because my hands start shaking with rage. I love working on cars. It's the only thing I've ever wanted to do. But I'm seriously thinking about finding another job. The thought of quitting makes me sick to my stomach. But if I have to keep watching Lance strut around the shop like he wants something, I'm going to end up doing something that lands me in jail. And then, who would take care of my dad? Update number 3. I finally got a lay on clearing my dad's name. But it started in the worst possible way. I was on the phone with Tracy during my lunch break, talking about maybe looking for another job since I couldn't stand working with Lance anymore. Tracy reminded me how hard it had been for her to find work and told me to hold on to what I had. When I hung up, I turned around to find Lance standing there with this weird look on his face, the same look he had right before he set my dad up. Sure enough, tools started disappearing again within days, But this time Lance went for bigger stuff: an entire floor jack, and expensive blowtorch, things you definitely couldn't just misplace. These weren't small wrenches anymore, we're talking hundreds of dollars worth of equipment. When Barry noticed, he called me into his office immediately. He still thought my dad and I had been working together to steal from the shop, and he made it clear that if anything else went missing, I'd be joining my dad in the unemployment line. I decided to turn Lance's game around on him. I started watching his every move in the shop, making note of when and where he went with tools. I also started working slower than usual, making sure I always had a reason to stay late. Even Barry noticed how long I was taking with basic jobs. Before he left each night, he'd do a quick inventory and remind me that my job was on the line if anything disappeared on my watch. I just nodded and told him I understood. I waited until I was sure the building was empty, then went into Barry's office. I went through his filing cabinet. One wrong move and I'd be proving Lance right about me being a thief, but I had to know the truth about Lance's background. When I found his employee file, I quickly took photos of all his previous jobs and references with my phone. Then I called Barry and put on my best sick voice, telling him I'd been feeling awful all day, which explained why I'd been working so slowly, and asked if he could cover my weekend shift. The whole time, I felt sick to my stomach lying to Barry after everything that had happened, but I kept reminding myself this was the only way to expose Lance's lies. I spent my day off playing detective, calling every place listed on Lance's application. His last job was at this salvage yard across town. When I called, pretending to be job hunting, the owner, Dale, sounded desperate for help and told me to come in right away. I drove over there, but as soon as I walked in and explained the real reason for my visit, I knew I'd made the right call. The moment I mentioned Lance's name, Dale's whole face changed. Turns out Lance had worked there all right up until Dale caught him stealing parts and tools. After firing Lance, Dale did some digging and discovered that every single reference on Lance's application was fake. When I showed Dale the photos from Lance's current application, he started laughing. The phone number Lance had listed for the salvage yard went to his mother's cell phone. The Dale who gave Lance a glowing reference when Barry called, that was Papa Lance, pretending to be his former boss. The guy had literally gotten his parents to pose as his references. Dale pulled out Lance's old application and showed me the same fake numbers. I basically begged Dale to call Barry and explain everything. Dale agreed right away. I think he felt partly responsible for not warning other shops about Lance after catching him. When he called, Barry verified it was really the salvage yard's number, but I could tell he wasn't completely convinced. The dash cam footage of my dad still had him doubting everything, plus he wasn't too happy about me sneaking around and lying to get the day off to investigate Lance. I get it, from his perspective, I probably looked just as untrustworthy as my dad at this point. Even with Dale backing up our story, Barry said he needed hard evidence before he could even think about bringing my dad back. The good news is that Dale offered my dad a job at the salvage yard until we could prove his innocence. At least Dad wouldn't have to keep looking for under-the-table work. But the best part was what Dale said as I was leaving, that if they'd had security cameras in the shop, they might have caught Lance's theft pattern sooner. That's when it hit me. I called Ryan as soon as I got home and told him my plan. He's studying criminal law now, so he knows exactly what kind of evidence we need to prove Lance has been setting us up. I don't want to say too much about what we're planning. Knowing Lance, he probably reads these Reddit posts looking for mentions of his name. But let's just say we're about to give Lance a taste of his own medicine. I'll update once we've put our plan into action. Update number 4, Reddit. I'm back with an update sooner than expected, and I think we finally got Lance. After my last post, I went straight to the electronics store and bought every small security camera they had in stock. The clerk probably thought I was paranoid, but I wasn't taking any chances this time. I got to the shop before sunrise the next morning and set up the cameras everywhere under workbenches, behind toolboxes, anywhere that would give us a clear view of the whole garage. Then, I put my acting skills to the test. When Lance arrived, I made sure he saw me storming into Barry's office looking upset. I was actually just telling Barry about the cameras, but to Lance, it probably looked like I was getting chewed out again about the missing tools. Around lunchtime I pulled out the big performance. I called Ryan on speakerphone, knowing Lance would be lurking nearby, trying to eavesdrop. Ryan and I had planned this part out carefully. I did my best to sound desperate and scared, telling him how his dad was threatening to fire me if anything else went missing, begging him to talk to Barry for me. Ryan played his part perfectly, telling me there was nothing he could do to help. When I hung up, I caught Lance pretending to organize his toolbox nearby, barely hiding a smirk. He took the bait exactly like we hoped he would. The next day was business as usual. I worked on cars, organized my tools. By closing time, nothing had happened, and I started worrying that maybe Lance had figured out what we were up to. But the following morning, I knew we had him. Lance always took his break right after me, but this time he waited an extra hour. The moment I saw him checking his watch and looking around the garage, I knew he was about to make his move. Sure enough, after Lance went on his break, our hydraulic impact wrench mysteriously vanished, along with a Slim Jim from the lockout kit. I had to fight to keep the smile off my face as I went to tell Barry. I didn't tell him exactly what Lance was planning to do with that Slim Jim, but Barry got the picture. He just nodded and said he'd follow my lead when the time came. Lance came back from his extended break, putting on the performance of his life. He started making a big show of looking for the impact wrench, getting more and more upset as he searched. Finally, he stormed into Barry's office like he'd just discovered the crime. When they came out together, I could see Barry was struggling not to laugh as he laid into me about the missing tools. His was almost as bad as Lance's, but Lance was too excited about his plan working to notice how fake it all seemed. Barry started yelling about checking everyone's cars, and we all marched out to the parking lot. The moment we got to my car, I knew Lance had taken the bait. He'd used the Slim Jim to break in and plant the evidence, just like we thought he would. He couldn't even wait more than a day after overhearing my phone call with Ryan before making his move. When Barry discovered a blanket in my back seat covering not just the missing impact wrench, but all the other tools that had disappeared over the past few weeks, I thought Lance was going to burst from pride. Lance was so confident he'd won that he actually held out his hand for me to shake, smirking as he said, "I guess this is goodbye." The look on his face, when Barry told us both to come back to the office, was priceless, but the real satisfaction came when Barry told me to grab the cameras. That's when Lance's smug smile finally cracked. The footage was beautiful, crystal clear from multiple angles. We had Lance on camera, stealing the impact wrench and Slim Jim. We had him breaking into my car. We even caught him planting all the other stolen tools under the blanket. The best part was when Lance, watching himself get exposed on camera, actually muttered, "Why didn't I think to plant the cameras?" When I set up, his dad, Barry's, head snapped up so fast, I thought he might hurt himself in trying to cover his tracks. Lance had just confessed to framing my father too. After Lance's confession and the camera footage, everything happened pretty fast. Barry called the police right there in the office, and they took Lance away in handcuffs. As they were leading him out, Barry shouted after them that Dale from the salvage yard would be more than happy to testify about Lance's history of theft. Watching Lance get pushed into that police car was probably the most satisfying moment of my life. Dad was back at work the next morning, and Barry even gave him a raise. I think Barry felt guilty about believing Lance's lies so easily, and was worried my dad might sue for wrongful termination, which he never would, but Barry didn't need to know that. Dale was disappointed to lose my dad as an employee so quickly, but he told us both that we'd always have a spot at the salvage yard if we needed it. It meant a lot knowing that at least one employer in town had seen through Lance's lies from the start. Dad's still living with me and Tracy for now. He could probably move back to his old place, but he doesn't want to rent from people who wouldn't give him a break when he needed one. I don't blame him. Besides, having him around has been nice. It reminds me of when I was a kid, except now I'm the one making sure he eats enough. The other day, I caught him in the kitchen at midnight, making lunches for all three of us to take to work the next day. Some things never change. After everything Lance put us through, seeing my dad back at work, joking with customers, and actually sleeping through the night again, that's all I really wanted. Story 2. Boyfriend's ex got me banned from his friend's wedding, where she was a bridesmaid, then had to watch us dance together when I was finally allowed in. My boyfriend Sam and I have been together for a year and a half. We broke up last summer for 2 months but got back together during our break. Sam met up with his ex-girlfriend, Rachel, whom he had dated for 4 years prior to our relationship. They only met up once, and nothing came of it. However, Rachel still has feelings for Sam and was hoping they would rekindle things. Rachel was enraged and threw a fit whenever she found out that Sam and I got back together. She sent him a lot of really nasty messages and continued to do so for several months afterward, even though he never responded to her. Rachel and Sam both have mutual friends who are getting married. They were both asked to be bridesmaids and groomsmen in the wedding in February. Rachel asked the bride if it would be okay if Sam did not have a +1 for the wedding because she wouldn't be able to handle seeing him with anyone else. Whenever Sam found this out, he immediately contacted both the bride and groom. They assured him that Rachel's request would not have an impact on the decision for a +1. Since then, she has still continued to try to reach out to Sam, including going as far as contacting me via Instagram regarding the upcoming wedding. She started to harass me, and even admitted that contacting me was for her own self-gain. In April, Sam and I were both invited to the engagement party. Of course Rachel was there, but we were having such a great time that we barely even noticed her existence. At 3:00 a.m. that night, Rachel texted Sam yet again, degrading both of us. She told Sam that he was not going to be getting a +1 to the wedding, and to not make a fuss about it like last time. I found the comment odd because invitations had not been sent out yet. Why is she the one telling him this instead of the bride or groom? Regardless, Sam finally responded to Rachel and told her to never contact us again. Fast forward to the present day. Sam got the wedding invitation, and it did not include a +1. He contacted the groom, and the response was that they had to prioritize other couples who have been together longer, live together, and or who both know the bride and groom due to the budget. I know 100% that a wedding should only be about the bride and groom and what they want. If they don't want Sam to have a plus one, that is their call. I'm not entirely convinced that Rachel did not have a part in the decision. She is a lot closer to the bride than Sam is to the groom. So I asked my boyfriend not to go to the wedding without me. This would mean he would have to drop out of being a groomsman. The only reason I feel uncomfortable with him going is due to the relentless harassment about the wedding by Rachel. If she had been respectful and left us alone, I would have no problem with him going without me. However, that was not the case. She has continuously disrespected me, my boyfriend, and our relationship. She has no clue what a boundary is. I just want this to be over. Update 1. My boyfriend talked to the groom. Due to the budget, they had to limit plus ones to couples who live together or will be traveling out of town to attend. The wedding is being paid for by the bride's family. It seems like they had an input on who was invited. The groom did not know the full extent of Rachel's behavior towards my boyfriend and me. The groom was also surprised to hear Rachel told my boyfriend in April he would not be getting a plus one, as they had not decided at that time. My boyfriend did come to see that it was disrespectful for the bride and groom not to allow him to have a plus one, even if his ex was not attending. The party should have priority over regular guests. With that being said, he does not want to completely burn a bridge with the groom, which I don't want to happen either. We both agreed it will be fine for him to attend the ceremony, but skip the reception. The groom said I would be allowed to attend the rehearsal dinner and welcome party. As far as Rachel, my boyfriend plans to ignore her and immediately shut down any of her antics. My boyfriend is truly disgusted with Rachel and her psychotic behavior. Ultimately, she wanted to break things up between me and my boyfriend, but she has only made us stronger. Additional info. OOP adds a little info not in the post. My boyfriend was never told he would be receiving a plus one. The bride and groom told him in February that they did not know who would be invited at that time. I just wanted to reiterate this in case it was not clear in my original post. When asked what happened with Sam and the ex, they didn't hook up. Whenever we were on the break, they just went to a bar for drinks. Afterwards, they met up with the bride and groom since they all are friends. My boyfriend said it was a bit awkward and didn't even know Rachel had any interest in getting back together until she found out we had gotten back together. Update 2 Sep 25, 2024. This is the final update regarding the wedding since it was this past weekend. Buckle up, because it's a long one. Backstory. My boyfriend was asked to be a groomsman in a wedding where his ex-girlfriend was a bridesmaid. His ex harassed him for months, even though he didn't respond. She reached out to me via Instagram. She has been trying to break us up and get him back. She told me on Instagram that she doesn't want to be around us during the wedding as it would be distracting. The groom told my boyfriend months ago that I would be allowed to attend the rehearsal dinner, welcome party, and part of the reception. We were told I would not be allowed to attend the ceremony or dinner portion of the reception due to the budget. After the formalities are completed, I will be allowed to attend. A week before the wedding, the groom invited my boyfriend to brunch on Sunday, the day after the wedding. He said it was going to be a super casual thing. However, I was not invited to this brunch. My boyfriend reassured me he would not be attending without me. During the wedding rehearsal, my boyfriend decided to double-check with the groom about me coming to the rehearsal dinner. It turns out I had been uninvited from the dinner. We were informed of this 30 minutes before the start. The groom told my boyfriend I did not have a seat, but he would love to have me at the welcome party afterward. My boyfriend skipped the rehearsal dinner. We ended up going to a local bar until the welcome party started. Once we got to the welcome party, the groom came up to me and apologized for the politics. He told me he was happy I was there and looked forward to having me at the reception tomorrow. 2 people commented on us missing the rehearsal dinner, but I just changed the subject. After the welcome party ended, we all rallied to a bar close by. I was standing at the bar talking to one of the guests when the bride imposed herself into our conversation. The bride would only look at and talk to the other girl, even though I was adding input into the conversation. It was just like the interview Shuri Flaw did with Blake Lively. I felt so uncomfortable that I ended up walking away. The next day, before the wedding, I met up for brunch with the girl. She informed me that as soon as I walked away, the bride started talking about me. The bride told her I was originally invited to the wedding, but that Rachel, my boyfriend's ex, said she would not be able to handle it, so I was uninvited from the wedding. The girl said it seemed like the bride was trying to get her to not be friends with me and to exclude me. She said it seemed like the bride was trying to get her to take Rachel's side as well. The bride admitted she was being petty, but that she didn't care. Mind you, I had just met this girl, and we were just casually chatting at the bar. Why the bride wanted to focus on causing drama and excluding me the night before her wedding is beyond me. Light girl focus on getting married. Around 8:00 p.m. is when all the formalities were finished, and I was able to attend. I'm not going to lie, dancing with my boyfriend in front of his ex-girlfriend felt extremely good. I swear we did not do it on purpose, but wherever his ex went, we were always right there. She could not avoid us even if she tried. At one point, the bride and groom were in the center dancing. I was directly across from his ex in her line of sight. She completely turned her back just so that she couldn't see me, even though everyone else was facing forward. The only people who would talk to us were the other groomsmen and their dates. We ended up telling several of them the full story because they had no idea, so the whole night felt like sweet revenge. I will say many times the groom came up to me and said he was happy I was there. Whether he meant it or it was performative, I have no idea. I also don't care at this point. The only reason my boyfriend did not drop out of the wedding was because we were told I was not invited due to the budget. We were assured several times that it had nothing to do with his ex. If my boyfriend had been given the full truth, he would have dropped out. Whenever I found out the truth, it was already too late. My boyfriend was at the venue taking pictures, and the wedding was starting in an hour. Once the couple gets back from their honeymoon, I and my boyfriend plan on having a conversation with the groom. My boyfriend said he will be reevaluating their friendship. Comments where OP has replied. OP clarifies one detail. Sorry, I didn't make it clear, but I was not allowed to attend the dinner portion of the reception. I was only allowed to attend when all the formalities were completed, eating, speeches, etc. and the dancing had begun. Commenter. You guys are both dumb as rocks if you think any of these people are currently your friends or will continue to be your friends in the future. So please stop excusing their shitty behavior for budget reasons. It's obvious you were not wanted at the wedding, and both of you should have skipped the event. A real friend would have made you comfortable and not made you feel excluded. Oop. Thankfully, after all of this, my boyfriend does see that the groom does not care about him as much as he thought. Greedy Encore Phillies for 25. Sounds like you have an amazing, supportive boyfriend. So refreshing to hear a man sticking with his partner through the nonsense. That bride isn't going to have an incredibly happy marriage after she willfully tried to sabotage someone else's relationship on her wedding day. That can't be the start of something successful. I'm hoping the groom had nothing to do with it, but I'm sure he knew about the situation since his wife was the one scheming. However, it does seem like he didn't want to be a part of it, given the way he was talking to you and your boyfriend. He probably just let her do whatever she wanted so she'd shut up. Either way, them all, you win in the end. Give your boyfriend a big hug from Reddit. He did well. Oop, my boyfriend really does have my back. I'm so thankful for him. As for the groom, I will say he truly is a nice guy. I do think that he was aware of everything going on, but he is the only reason I was able to attend some of the wedding weekend. Next story. My girlfriend made me borrow her boss's clothes at his party. She said he was just a friend until I had to watch her tuck him into bed while he was in his underwear. I am a PhD student who has been dating an executive assistant for 5 months. It's going well. We have a lot of fun. We're both crazy busy, so frequently our dates are Chinese food and Redbox movies, but it's all good. She goes to a lot of events with her boss, business dinners and charities, and basically anything where he's too lazy to bring a notepad and makes her give up her finite free time to accompany him. I get invited to some, partially due to my desire to actually see my girlfriend and due to school and work. I went to the first one last weekend to dinner at his house, a casual business mixer type deal. I was underdressed. My definition of business casual was navy slacks and a button-up. By the time I showed up, a little late admittedly, it was too late to stop by my place and fix this. Oh well, I'm confident. I don't care, but she seems to and is slightly irritated. We get there and I meet her boss, who's kind of smug and a bit of an ass but seems nice enough. Right away she asks Rob, do you mind if Cohen borrows a tie and jacket? I didn't relay the dress code. He says, that's unlike you, but sure, the jacket, it will be too big in the shoulders, but go ahead. She leads me up to the guy's bedroom and goes right into his closet and grabs some stuff. That night, everyone basically ignored me. She didn't seem to notice. She was too busy backing up everything this guy said and mingling with coworkers. She apologized later, said she can get a bit obsessive about work. I understand. I vowed to never go back, and that was that. Last night I was over and using her computer for some assignments. Mine is down. I go to send myself an email of my work. Hers is up, and I figure whatever will work just as good until I notice that the subject of one is, your boyfriend. I open it. It's from the boss. Your boyfriend has my favorite tie. Procure it promptly. You would choose that one out of the 100 other ones, wench. GF. It is already back in your closet. I can't help it. He looks nice and red. Tom, what did you think of him anyways? Approve. Boss, he looked like a little kid playing dress up in my clothes, but in all seriousness, he is a little kid. He's still in school, and in an immature place. He's not husband material. You want kids in a house in a couple of years? Date someone who can give you that. Date a man. GF, thanks for being honest. I value your opinion. Husbands aren't exactly growing on trees though. That was the last. I left soon after and haven't talked to her about it. I feel completely disrespected. At the same time, I read her email, which is a no. How should I approach this? Update 1. I followed some of the advice and told her how I stumbled across it and all that jazz. She was upset I read her work emails, but understood why I wasn't happy with what I saw. She explained that her boss is more than a boss. He's also a friend, and collectively, they've been through a lot together. In the 3 years they've worked together, they've each lost a parent. Her father was estranged from her family, and none of her siblings would go with her to the funeral, but he volunteered and helped her handle it, and they have climbed the corporate ladder together. She explained that it was private, the same as me asking my friend on FB what they thought of her and her reading it, so I'm a little uncomfortable with it, and their closeness in general. I also told her it irritated me that she didn't specify that business casual meant in her world. She said that a button-up would have been fine, but I wore a plaid one, a nice plaid button-up, not lumberjack, and that was too casual. She also told me she was mad at me for being late, that it's important to Rob that when he hosts, she is early and on time. Late is late, and late is very late. We didn't deal with the big issues, babies and marriage, because it's just too damn soon, and went on our way being happy this week until last night around 2:00 a.m. The boss calls and says he's sick. She needs to check up on him, blah blah. She's about to leave. I express my discomfort, and she reluctantly invites me, tells me to keep clear of him and just wait. It shouldn't be long and she'll use my presence to avoid staying long. We get there and he's in the front room. I can't avoid him seeing me. He's in his underwear, which I'm not happy about, and is obviously fairly sick and furious about being sick. GF is ridiculously tender with him, rubbing his hair and telling him how they can readjust most of his meetings, except for one, and they'll make it a phone meeting. They'll work from home tomorrow. She'll go get everything in the morning and just bring it to his place. Blah blah. He makes eye contact. I'm hovering as close to the door as I can, feeling for all the world like I'm the interloper, and he almost looks smug at me. I swear to God he did. Then he asks if they can have one soup for lunch and fortune cookies like usual. She says of course, and then brings him to his room and tucks him in, I assume after giving him some medicine. We leave and get into it. That's just too close for me. She needs to draw lines, if she wants to keep dating me. She accuses me of just being jealous and uncomfortable. She says Rob has never made a pass at her and never will. Fight gets a little ugly and insults fly. I say she all but gets paid to suck his dick. She says the only difference between me and a college freshman is I can buy beer, and it's over. This all occurs in his driveway. She gets out and says she'll just stay here if he wasn't too sick to get it up. I imagine they probably had sex. Comments were, OP has replied, Tech is, holy, she has gone crazy town. You should stay super far away from that. I know it's hard, but I have a feeling you're going to get over this one quick and laugh it off in a couple of months. Also, they climb the corporate ladder together. She's a glorified secretary. She's climbing something, but it's no corporate ladder. I mean, when he gets promoted, her pay grade does go up, and he chose to have her come with him instead of opting for someone with more experience or whatever. I hope you're right. I was pretty pissed and all righteously angry, but now that that is fading, I'm kinda bummed out. She was a good person, funny, smart and sexy as hell. We spent 5 months together. I don't want to miss her. Tilda deleted the difference between you and a college freshman is that a college freshman would have tackled him to the ground and pummeled his face, and when he answered the door in his underwear. I didn't realize he was just in underwear at first, and by then I could tell he was very sick, couldn't keep down water, etc., and less inclined to be aggressive. She has a key, and he was on the couch using a throw blanket thing. Update 2. Well, I've been drowning my sorrows in Newcastles and biographies when I got a text from my ex-girlfriend. I obviously hoped she was begging for forgiveness and pleading me to come back to her, both because I missed her and I wanted to turn her down. I'm a complicated fool of a man. She was not. I wanted to let you know I'm sorry for what I said. Once you compared my entire career to that of a prostitute, I lost my temper and said a lot of things I regret. I hate to end on a bad note because we were both hurt and lashed out. I also wanted to let you know you were right about Rob, just because I would want to know if I were you, and you deserved to know you weren't crazy. I didn't think he felt the same way, and I resigned myself to trying to love someone else. I didn't do a good job. How could I when he was constantly there? And it turns out he's felt the same way all along. He just didn't think he could cross the line. It had to be me because Rob felt, as my superior, there was no appropriate way to confess his love. 2 years of us being stupid and stubborn, but we are finally together. We are hashing through it with her now, and they're not giving us any problems. Sorry we put you in the middle of our personal games. I wish you all the best. So, she is going to live happily ever after, never loved me, and I wasted 5 months. Going to become a monk now, Reddit. J2G. Fine. God. Edit. I don't want to do an update because there is no reason to do one, but I would like to just say that I don't begrudge her happiness or want her to catch on fire or anything like that. I'm a little bummed out that it ended this way because despite this, she was a fun girlfriend. We did a lot of fun stuff together, and she even read, so we had a lot to talk about, and she is extremely smart. Honestly, she does a lot of her boss's work and gives great throwback. If it weren't for her family, she would have gone on to be an executive, not an assistant. But I'm not getting drunk or wasting away. I am just having a few cold ones and playing video games, because I'm an introvert, and this is how I cheer myself up. Anyways, my point is I'm not a hero, and she isn't the villain. We never said we loved each other or anything. I saw it maybe going in that direction, unless I end up teaching in Nebraska or something. I said a shitty thing to her, and it all unwound from there, and I did start the argument in that conversation. Now that it's done, I realize I'm a little disappointed and a little bitter, but I don't hate her or want her to lose her job or get crabs. I just kind of want everyone to be happy and maybe to get laid this weekend. Not that we'll be friends, I just don't have time to hate her. Thanks for all the advice. Comments where OP has replied, salty fresh. I don't know the whole story, but giving all those details is so very unnecessary. What a move. It would have sufficed to say, your suspicions were right. I'm sorry I lied to you. I hope we can be friends, instead of delving into the details of her romantic affairs with someone else while knowing she broke your heart. You shouldn't have compared her to a prostitute. Oop, yeah, looking back, that's why we broke up that night, not that we should have stayed together, because obviously, it wasn't going to work out. But when you start a conversation with K, you see, he basically pays you to suck his dick. Most people aren't willing to be constructive. And that's when she said shitty things, and I said shitty things, and she decided she would rather not drive home with me and decided to stay there. They talked and decided they were in love, or whatever the kids call it. So it was a pretty spiraled up night, and I was still angry when I wrote my last update, which might be a tad biased. Story 3. Mom sold our dad's house behind our backs to buy her jobless new husband a boat, but he left her for another woman. Now she's begging to live with me after spending all the money. My mom, 50F, has had a very interesting life, if that's the correct adjective in this sense. She was never a bright student, which was fine because my grandparents believed that women needed to take care of the house and family. She grew up with those beliefs, and continues to hold on to them today. She got married to my dad 2 years after she finished school, when she was 20. At 21, she had my older sister, Jasmine, now 29F, and 2 years later, she had me, Bianca, now 27F. Both my sister and I were always closer to Dad. He didn't share the same views as Mom, and was very supportive. He encouraged us to do well in school, enrolled us in a bunch of extracurricular activities, and made it a point to always be there. He drowned me in art supplies because I love sketching, and he never let my sister miss a single day of soccer practice because that was where she showed potential. He was always there for us, and this really irked my mother. She didn't like us having hobbies. She didn't like the fact that we were academically inclined, and our nature and Dad's support actually caused her to lose a lot of respect in her family. My maternal grandparents in particular didn't like us much. All of this changed when Dad passed away when I was 11. He was in a car crash, and after being hospitalized for a few days, he passed away. This was a huge emotional and financial blow for my mother, and of course, for us too. I don't want to go into the emotional ordeal we went through because it's not relevant, but financially, we were done for. Dad's hospital stay had racked up thousands of dollars, and we didn't have enough insurance to cover it. Most of his savings went to pay the bills, and my mother had no savings of her own since she wasn't employed. A few weeks after his death, I remember we had to sell a lot of our stuff. I sold my art supplies, my sister stopped going to soccer practice, and we were given household chores to do. My life had completely changed, and I hated every bit of it. But there was nothing I could do because I was still dependent on my mother. That's when my paternal grandparents stepped in to help. We had never been very close because they lived 3 states away, so we didn't see each other much, but whenever I did meet them, they were always sweet to me. When my grandfather came to visit us, he was shocked to hear that Mom had sold my stuff to make ends meet. He offered to cover the cost of our hobbies and interests, but my mother shut down the proposal, saying she needed money to help us survive, not to fund our useless interests. She said if he wanted to send money, it should be for groceries or electricity. My grandfather got annoyed and said she could work to make ends meet, and he would be willing to take over the extra costs. Ensuring our survival was her responsibility, and it'd only help if she fulfilled her duties. My mother said no, and that was that. Even at that point, my mother still hadn't started working and was living off handouts from family, and these handouts were not consistent. Some months we had a lot, some months we had next to nothing. It was mostly her parents paying our way. She flat out refused to get a job, insisting it was the duty of the men in her family to support her because she genuinely believed it was a man's job to provide. This went on for a few months, and her parents took pity on her and us and provided for our needs, but soon enough that money stopped coming regularly. Mom was severely cash-strapped, and Jasmine and I had to take out jobs for extra cash. Every weekend, we could be seen at a neighbor's house walking their dog, weeding their garden, etc. It was tough, but even then, Mom didn't start working. Finally, her parents had had enough, and they sat her down for a talk. They told her they could no longer support her and us because they had planned to live out their retirement years a certain way and couldn't afford to take care of us anymore. This came as a huge shock to Mom's surprise because she had assumed that since Dad had died, it was her father's responsibility to take care of us since men provide. It was hard to argue with that logic, especially since my grandparents had raised her that way, but now they were changing their tune. They said it was the job of the husband to provide for his wife, and if the husband is no more, then the wife needs to provide for the kids. They were essentially cutting her off because it had been made clear to both my mom and her sister that all their property would go to their brother. It was a show with a lot of name, calling and tears, but my grandparents wouldn't budge. My mother asked her sister, Auntie Janice, for help. Now, Auntie Janice was a great woman and had a soft spot for us. Her husband was a surgeon, and even though they didn't interact with us much, he was willing to help. But what we got from them wasn't enough to support a family of 3, so Mom went back to my paternal grandparents. My grandfather was more than willing to help, but only on the condition that my mom worked too. She had no choice but to agree because there was no way we could survive without their help. She got a housekeeping job at a nearby hotel, and it paid decently, so our lives were back on track. With help from our uncle and grandpa, we were back to living comfortably. This arrangement continued for the next 2 years, until I was 14, and my sister was 16. That's when our mother introduced us to Dan. Dan was her new boyfriend, and they wanted to get married. One look at him and Jasmine and I were disgusted. He looked and smelled like a pig, and I'm not exaggerating. It felt like the last time he bathed was in high school. He reeked of cigarettes, and had this lost look on his face, as if he couldn't register a single word anyone said to him. Needless to say, Jasmine and I didn't just disapprove of him, we hated him with all our hearts. Unfortunately, Mom was madly in love with him, or so she claimed. They got married in a hush-hush ceremony, and Jasmine and I were sworn to secrecy. We couldn't tell anyone on Dad's side of the family that Mom had gotten married again. She was worried that if our grandparents found out, they'd stop the monthly payments, and since it was a generous amount, we genuinely couldn't have done without it. So Jasmine and I kept quiet. I don't know what was going through Mom's head when she married Dan, but I think she thought that if she got married and had a man in her life, she wouldn't have to work anymore, and he'd take care of everything. I'm sure that was her assumption because a week into their marriage, she quit her job and was back at home. The problem was Dan was unemployed, chronically unemployed. He couldn't hold a job for more than 2 months, and after that, he'd sit at home playing video games, then maybe look for another job when he got bored of the games. All of Mom's dreams came crashing down because this man had no intention of providing for any of us. Jasmine and I went back to doing our jobs for people to earn some spending money, so in this family of 4, most of the money came from my father's parents or my mother's sister's husband. It was dysfunctional to say the least, and Jasmine and I were desperate to move out. We kept our interactions with Mom and Dan to a minimum, focusing on school and our part-time gigs. This was the setup for the next 4 years, until I left for college, and went low contact with Mom. By the time I was on the verge of leaving, Mom and Dan were having problems because, in addition to being unemployed, Dan was also a serial cheater, which honestly came as no surprise to either me or my sister. Mom kept forgiving him, or pretending not to notice, but things were messy. Once I went to college, I went very low contact with Mom. I stayed in touch with my grandparents and aunt and uncle, so somehow, my mother always had information about what was going on in my life. I graduated from college when I was 23 and landed a decent job. After that, the problem was that I graduated right before COVID, so my promotions and raises were small. I couldn't save as much as I thought I would, and life kind of came to a halt for a bit. My grandpa, the good one, offered me some help, but I didn't want to burden him, so I said no. Thankfully, I wasn't laid off, so I shouldn't complain too much. A few months ago, I got a promotion at work and a hefty pay raise. This put me in a comfortable position to buy a small house. Since I'd also saved during the COVID years, I lived as frugally as possible, and even though I'd targeted becoming a homeowner by 25, this was just a 2-year delay, so I was happy. I don't know how, but my mother found out I'd bought a house. She called me saying she wanted to meet me, because it had been so long since she saw her baby. I knew something was up because the last time I saw her was during my final semester of college. I had never asked to meet her after that, and she had never offered. I told her I'd let her know when I was free and get back to her. I wasn't planning to get back to her ever. She then said it was urgent, and that I needed to let her know soon. I knew she wanted something from me, so I made an excuse and ended the call. 2 days later, she called again, saying she was in a bit of a mess and needed my help. Before I could even agree to help, she said she heard I'd bought a house, and wanted me to let her and Dan move in. They basically wanted to move in together into my house. I couldn't help but laugh at her audacity. I told her I was surprised Dan was still around, and I'd hoped she'd left him. I said I didn't have a house like she thought. It was a studio with a balcony, and there was no way the 3 of us could fit. I didn't want to tell her that I didn't want her there, so I hoped the size and space argument would be enough to deter her, but I'd been too hopeful. She told me since it was a 1-bedroom apartment, I could vacate, and she and Dan could move in together. I told her there was no way that was happening. I hadn't worked so hard just to have someone else live in my house. Plus, I had a mortgage to pay. I told her I'd charge her the market rate for rent, and she lost it. She started screaming at me, saying she couldn't believe I'd take rent from my own mother, and that she hadn't raised her daughters to be such leeches. I told her I didn't have time for either her or her screaming, and if she wanted to beg for scraps, she could do it somewhere else. I hung up and blocked her. I called Jasmine to see if Mom had given her a similar call, but she said no. The last time they talked was a month ago when Mom asked where she was living. Jasmine told her she had moved in with her boyfriend and that they were saving up for a house together. I couldn't understand why Mom needed a place to stay in the first place. She still had our dad's old house, the one we grew up in, where Dan had moved in with us. I had no idea why there was suddenly a need for her to move somewhere else. I called my paternal grandparents to ask about the house. That's when I got the full picture of what was really going on. So the house we grew up in was in my grandfather's name. It was supposed to legally go to Dad when my grandparents passed away. The understanding was that my dad and his brother, our Uncle Liam, would each be given a house owned by my grandfather so they could live rent-free. This was to give them a good start in life and allow them to invest in properties for their children. So, legally, the deed to our childhood home wasn't in my father's name, but in my grandfather's. When Dad died, my grandmother was adamant that Grandpa should keep the house in his name so it could be given to Jasmine and me when we became adults. However, considering Mom was unemployed, Grandpa didn't want to create more trouble for her. I think he also felt bad for her, which is why when she asked him to, he transferred ownership of the house to my mother. This was done with the understanding that when I turned 25 and Jasmine 27, the house would be given to us. I now believe this is why Mom told us to be careful and not mention that she had married Dan. Word eventually got out though. According to Grandpa, they found out she had remarried and were upset that she'd kept it from them. That's when they wanted to change the ownership of the house as soon as possible. They insisted that since Jasmine was an adult, and I was almost one, they wanted to get the paperwork done to make sure Dan and Mom couldn't do anything with the house. But very conveniently, a few weeks after they made their intentions clear, Mom told them Dan had left her for another woman. She was sobbing uncontrollably, which naturally made my grandparents not want to pursue the ownership issue anymore. Gradually they forgot about it, and it took a backseat. That was the last time they talked to her about the house, and their contact with her had been sporadic since. I told Grandpa that Mom had called me saying she wanted to move into my house with Dan. If that was the case, what had happened to Dad's house? He said he'd try to find out because he had no idea she'd gotten back with Dan, or that she was planning to move. I have a bad feeling about this, and I'm sure it's going to erupt into more drama soon. Edit. To everyone who's commented, surprised that I didn't know such important details about my mother's life. This is what happens when you go low contact. I chose to cut her out of my life, and I have no regrets. The minute I turned 18, I bolted from the house in her life, and I've been very formal with her since. That's why I didn't know that Dan had left her, or that he'd come back. As for why Jasmine and I didn't know about the house, well, we were kids. We assumed our mother would protect us, and so did our grandparents. That's why the topic of property or home ownership never came up. Grandpa and Grandma never thought to discuss it with us because, at the time, we were minors, and they were dealing with our mother, who was supposed to take care of us, not cheat us. As of now, Jasmine and I don't know what happened to Dad's house, but we're going to ask Mom and possibly stage an intervention if it comes to that. I'll keep you guys updated. Update 1. Things are bad. 2 weeks after my first post, Jasmine, her boyfriend, my grandparents, and I decided to meet with Mom and try to see what was going on. We didn't tell her we were coming, so she was surprised when we showed up. This part, when we went to our house, Dad's house, our childhood home, the door was opened by a young couple. We initially thought they were relatives of Dan's or maybe Mom's friends, but they said they were the owners of the property. I wanted to laugh because I didn't believe them, but what they said was true. Mom had sold the house without informing either Jasmine or me, or getting my grandparents' consent. Interestingly enough, the sale had happened over 6 months ago. Our house had been sold by her 6 months ago on the sly, and now there's nothing we can do. Unfortunately, since the paperwork and transfer of ownership were never completed by my grandparents, she was the legal owner of the house, and it was within her rights to sell it. This has come as a huge shock to everyone, and we all feel betrayed and disgusted. We tried to find out where. She was living in some shady neighborhood downtown in a one-bedroom flat surrounded by junkies. This was Dan's place, and I wasn't surprised. He looks like a junkie himself, so it made sense. When Mom saw all of us standing together, she turned as white as a ghost. She literally tried to close the door on us, but we weren't having it. Thankfully, we had Jasmine's boyfriend with us. He's a strapping man, 6'4" and pretty intimidating. We forced our way inside, and there was Dan lounging on the sofa, with a cigarette in his hand, and a dazed look on his face. Mom nervously greeted us, but we went straight for the jugular. I told her I knew Dad's house was supposed to go to us, and that she had sold it without informing Jasmine, me, or our grandparents. She burst out crying, saying that if she hadn't done it, Dan wouldn't have come back. Basically, she launched into this long sob story about how Dan had left her twice for 2 different women. When Mom had that conversation with Grandpa about the house and told him Dan had left, he had actually left. She had to beg and plead for him to come back. He finally returned when he got kicked out of his new girlfriend's house. Then a year later, Mom caught him cheating with a girl barely out of her teens. I just looked at her like she was insane. I asked why she hadn't left him when he was so problematic and wasn't helping her out in any way. She had no response to that, and I didn't have the patience to feel sorry for her. My grandmother was furious. She screamed at Mom, telling her she wasn't interested in hearing excuses for why she'd been such a colossal failure. All she cared about was the house that was supposed to go to Jasmine and me. Mom said she'd sold the house because Dan wanted to buy a boat. Now this man knows nothing about boats. All I know is that he worked as a Coast Guard for a couple of months at a beach a few miles away, and that's when he decided he wanted a boat. He threatened to leave Mom again if she didn't help him buy one, so my mother, the biggest genius on the planet, sold her house and used part of the money to buy this idiot a boat. The rest of the money, instead of saving, she gave to him. He spent all of it, every single dime. When they had nothing left, he had to sell the boat and buy this condo they were living in, and guess what? They hated it. That's why Mom wanted to ask if I could let her and Dan stay with me. After she finished her story, she admitted in defeat that she was sure I wouldn't let her live with me anymore. Before I could say anything, Jasmine tore into her, and boy was she brutal. She listed all the ways Mom had failed us as a mother and failed Dad as a wife. He had robbed us of the one thing that would have kept us connected to our father just to support her deadbeat husband who didn't care about her. She told Mom she was dead to her, and should never expect to hear from her again. I couldn't say much because I was still in shock, but I agreed with Jasmine. There was nothing I wanted to do with my mother. Mom started sobbing, saying she didn't deserve to be treated like this. We told her she did. She had stolen from us, from our grandparents, and most importantly, she had robbed us of a connection with our childhood and our father. We weren't going to forgive her ever. We left. Since then, she's tried calling us and our grandparents, but none of us are speaking to her. There's nothing we can do about the house. That money and property are gone for good. I'm considering saving up and buying it if it ever gets listed again because I don't want to lose that part of my childhood, but I know it's a far-fetched dream and not very practical. My grandparents are furious and heartbroken, but there's nothing they can do either. Grandpa keeps cursing himself for trusting her, and we keep telling him he couldn't have known she would do this. Just a sad state of affairs, and we all feel helpless. Update: Dan left Mom again. I know it sounds cruel, but I love every bit of it. Apparently, she's been trying to get in touch with us using new numbers and whatnot, but neither Jasmine nor I have responded. She tried to involve Auntie Janice. I got a call from her last week asking me to talk to Mom. I told her not to get involved and spilled everything to her. She was horrified because she didn't know the house was supposed to go to us. She apologized for trying to take Mom's side and has since blocked her. Whatever little updates I got from Mom were through Auntie Jam, and she told me Dan had left her. Mom is now homeless with nowhere to go. Auntie Janice and her husband were initially willing to take her in, but after they learned what Mom did to us, they put their foot down and said no. Yesterday, I got an email from Mom. She basically said she was down and out, homeless, and had nowhere to go. She asked me to let her stay with me while she looked for a job. I know it's a lie. She's not going to look for a job, and if I take her in, she'll never leave. I haven't responded yet because I don't want her here, but I also feel bad about letting her live on the streets. She genuinely has nowhere to go. One who would be willing to help her. I know she brought this on herself, and she's the only one to blame, but I can't help feeling sorry for her. I hope I don't cave because I know if I do, she'll ruin my life. Update 3. I told Jasmine about Mom's email, and she said she got something similar. She hadn't responded either, but said that deep down, she was tempted to help her. Jasmine told me she'd support my decision, but advised me to think it through carefully because we both know what Mom is like, and if I let her in, she'll control and destroy whatever peace I have. After a long talk, Jasmine knocked some sense into me. Thankfully, I ended up responding to Mom. I wrote her a long email telling her I wouldn't help her, neither now nor ever. I let everything out. The betrayal, the anger, the resentment, and the disgust. I marked her email as spam, so I don't know if she's responded. I did send her contacts for some women's shelters that could help her, but that's as far as I'll go. She has been emotionally negligent and financially malicious our whole lives, and she doesn't deserve our help anymore. I don't know what she's going to do, and I've asked Andy and Janice to keep me out of it. I don't need updates on her life. She's not my mother anymore, and she was the worst part of my childhood. I'm ready to leave her behind.